Hi, I'm Joe Aldi. I'm the host of the Energy Policy Seminar. Welcome to everybody who's with us here in the room on this rather chilly morning in Cambridge. Welcome to everybody else who's joining us via Zoom. We're thrilled to have with us today Alex Clark for his talk, Capitalizing on Coal, Evaluating Early Retirement Options for BRI Coal Plants. Alex is a PhD researcher at the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment at the University of Oxford, where his research focuses on the identification and transmission of fossil fuel-related economic risk in the public sector, and how governments and their agents should respond to these risks with a focus on China. He's currently a visiting predoctoral fellow at the Belfer Center. He is a former Global China Initiative Fellow at Boston University, a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, a European scholar?
Yeah,
European, apologies, a European scholar, and a 2021 Summer Program Fellow at EASA. Alex, we've enjoyed having you here as an attendee in the seminar, and now we're thrilled to have you as a speaker. Welcome to the Energy Policy Seminar.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being here, everyone. Particularly Thanksgiving week. It's great to see everybody here, and I know people have got finals and so on. So thank you for coming. So I'll probably talk for about 45 minutes or so, depending on how this presentation goes. It's the first time I've given it, so I'm not quite sure how to judge time. But let's see. So just before getting into it, a bit of background on me. I'm wrapping up a PhD DPhil at the University of Oxford. And in the last few years, I've worked at the European Council on Foreign Relations, which is a sort of geopolitical analysis think tank in Europe, the Climate Policy Initiative, which I think has come up once or twice in this series and works primarily on green finance and sustainable finance, mostly in the public sector, mostly outside the OECD. And after this all too brief stint at the Belfer Center, I'll be at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia until the end of April. So the work that I'm about to present has been sort of completed and written up in full form in the last 3 months at the Belfer Center, to which I'm extremely grateful for hosting me. But it is part of a longer piece of work that was conducted partly with the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, which is just across the river. And I should also mention my co-authors on this piece of work, Cecilia Hans Springer, who was actually here last week to talk about Indonesia, as well as Abhinav Jindal, who's at NTPC, which is a large Indian coal company. Girish Shamali at Oxford University, who's now just become the head of transition finance research there. And Ryan Rafferty is a postdoc at Oxford, specialized in political economy. Just a moment to acknowledge a fallen comrade. Last night, I was driving back from New York in this beauty, and the alternator went. And this was about -6 Celsius, 7 p.m., 3 hours away from Boston. So I'm very happy to have made it back 2 a.m. last night. So just a moment for Klaus, my BMW. All right, so into the substance. What motivates this piece of work is the particular challenge of early retirement for coal that's financed by Chinese entities. So just a bit of background on why we might want to do this. As most of you no doubt know, the estimates suggest that unabated coal power, meaning coal power without full carbon capture and storage, must be phased out by 2040 for 1.5 degrees Celsius warming on average to be remotely possible. There's obviously, of course, a whole argument about whether 1.5 C is possible at all at this point, and this has been a big contentious issue at COP27 the last couple of weeks. But at the very minimum, if there's any chance of meeting this target, it's most likely that the whole fleet globally will need to be phased out or equipped with carbon capture technology. Now, the global coal fleet nowadays operates mostly in regulated markets. What I mean by that is markets in which either the supply side, meaning coal prices, or the demand side, meaning electricity markets, are not fully liberalized. There's some price controls or other distortions in the market that mean that they diverge from being the paradigm of a free market. Now, early retirement of coal is not a new idea. It's been proceeding with some success in several OECD countries, the UK with the aid of a carbon price floor, the US in several states, mostly in the Southwest, using a series of mechanisms, which I'll get to in a moment, and in Germany through the use of reverse auctions. And global coal use is trending downwards. Most analysts believe that it's certainly peaked, but there's still a huge problem in the non-OECD coal fleet. So as of about 1.5 to 2 years ago, China became home to half of global coal capacity. That's obviously a little different from generation because that depends on how many hours per year each plant is operating and the quality of the coal that it's using and so on. But by and large, the coal fleets outside the OECD are larger. They're younger, meaning they've been built in the last 10, 15 years, as opposed to the last 30, 35 years, which is more typical for developed country markets. Hence, more vulnerable to asset stranding. They operate in less free markets, and so they're harder to retire. I'll just go through some of the literature and background on what coal retirement mechanisms might look like. So what factors might be important when you're thinking about retiring a coal plant early? And by that, I mean ahead of its originally intended lifetime, which is typically 30 years, but could be much longer. First and foremost is, who is the lender financing the plant? Who is the sponsor who owns the equity in it? Is it a state-owned enterprise or SOE, a private firm, a government, a joint venture that mixes the two, a state bank, so on? How the tariff is structured. Some particularly regulated markets might have full pass-through not only of operating costs, but also financing costs, meaning they're essentially bulletproof investments. The cost of capital, how the capital structure is designed, the access to financial instruments in a given market. So in the US, there's been approaches using securitization of ratepayer-backed bonds to retire coal early in Colorado and elsewhere. That's not necessarily an option in markets where there's not a deep enough bond market for securitization to necessarily work. And the same applies for green bonds. Special purpose vehicles are some other ways of doing this. But basically, they boil down to the following three options. One is to just refinance, which is done all the time for infrastructure projects in particular. Once you build something and it's operating and it's selling electricity or whatever it's selling, the risk associated with that project has declined, so it can typically be refinanced at a lower interest rate, reflecting that lower risk. In principle, that can free up some cash to be able to reinvest in new projects or pay down debt faster or exit early or retire early. Some of the other options are refinancing and reinvestment twins, such that the condition of refinancing, particularly in a sort of public climate finance world, is that some of the freed up cash flows are used for reinvestment in renewables. We're not really going to touch that in this presentation, but I'm just putting it out there as an option. And the third is an acquisition. This is something that's actively under discussion by the Asian Development Bank, which is developing a blended finance fund that it's calling the Energy Transition Mechanism, essentially where the debt and or the equity of the plant are transferred to this blended fund, so a mixture of private and concessional capital, and some form of concessionality is used to close down the plant early. And there are also all sorts of questions there about how you value future cash flows to the coal plant, particularly in countries where there's increasingly stringent climate policy. Do you value the coal plant at 100% of book value or less? And the cost to the public in terms of subsidies and so on does depend on this. So just a quick whistle-stop tour of what's being used around the world today. I've kind of been through the US case, which is using securitized ratepayer-backed bonds, which can typically be raised at a fairly low cost of finance to support refinancing renewable investment. As I've mentioned, this is not necessarily feasible due to the depth or lack thereof of bond markets in non-OECD markets. And it may be possible as a hard currency transaction, but it hasn't really been explored in any detail to this point. Some of you may be familiar with a Just Transition transaction in South Africa, not to be confused with the Just Energy Transition Partnership, JETP, which is the same acronym that you may have come across in the news the last week or so with respect to Indonesia. But the Just Transition transaction the work on this was started essentially 3 years ago or so, and it would involve a blended finance fund buying a debt from Eskom, the state-owned utility, with a sustainability-linked credit enhancement. What that means is the interest rate on the loan would depend on achieving certain milestones set as part of the contract. So this is similar in structure to a sustainability-linked loan or bond, which is an instrument that's starting to be deployed in capital markets more broadly. The energy transition mechanism is a bit earlier stage, and it's being developed by the Asian Development Bank for specific applications in Southeast Asia. Looks like the first application in reality will be Vietnam, for reasons that we'll get into. But it's essentially a blended fund with concessional finance in exchange for emissions reduction, so not dissimilar. Germany has had a coal phase-out act passed some time ago now, where essentially coal plant owners would bid for compensation for closing down their plant early in a competitive auction process. This is quite controversial, and it's actually gone to the European Commission for investigation as a possible breach of state aid rules. And there are all sorts of debates over whether this is equitable or efficient, given that a lot of the plants in question were already uneconomic and may have had to shut down entirely for market reasons anyway. Just briefly, there have been other examples in Chile where future emissions reductions from early retirement are monetized and guaranteed by a public sector partner. In this case, I believe it's the Inter-American Development Bank in coalition with a couple of other public finance partners. The Just Transition mechanism in the EU, which is less focused on early retirement and is more focused on helping coal regions transition through new investment, economic diversification in exposed areas, and repurposing of coal assets. The Accelerating Coal Transition instrument backed by the Climate Investment Funds, which is a sort of blend of all of the above, but hasn't yet been launched. And then finally, just because it's really front of mind for a lot of people now, I'll just quickly look at the Just Energy Transition Partnership in Indonesia. So this was agreed at COP27 / the G20 not too long ago, and it involves a $20 billion commitment to help Indonesia peak emissions 7 years early, get to 34% renewables by 2030. That looks nice, but in the pre-JETP world, it was already intending to hit 23% by 2025. So this is not necessarily a huge jump. But interestingly, it is specifically targeting 5 gigawatts of coal for early retirement, a doubling of the rates of renewable deployment. There are a bunch of banks that you'll recognize backing it on the private sector side. And Germany is working on similar deals with Vietnam and India, both of which are countries that I'll come to in more detail. It's just not clear at this point, however, that the JETP model can be applied to the plants that I will be focusing on in this presentation, BRI coal plants. And over the next few slides, I'll explain why. So BRI, for those who are not aware, refers to the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a fairly, I wouldn't say necessarily well-defined strategic initiative backed by the Chinese government that essentially involves a range of infrastructure investments across, I think, well over 90 countries, probably much more than that by now, are signatories or have signed some sort of memorandum of understanding or something similar with China. And under this program, retroactively and under the specific moniker of the Belt and Road Initiative, a substantial amount of currently operating coal capacity has been financed. So what we try to do in this work, starting from this point, is to understand what the cost and benefits of using these different models that we've looked at, or new models, to retire BRI coal plants early, understand who benefits, when is there a case for early retirement according to the mechanism used, and perhaps most importantly, you can do the numbers, but unless you understand the political economy context of the countries that you're targeting, you're not necessarily going to get anywhere. So that was a big focus of this work as well, and the particular contribution of Ryan Rafferty. So coal in the BRI in general, I think it can't be boiled down to a couple of sentences, but broadly, it's driven by a longer-term trend of internationalization of Chinese state-owned enterprises' activities. And by state-owned enterprises, I mean companies 100% owned by the Chinese state, but also, I think it's fair to say that any company that has even a minority state interest could be considered, to an extent, a state-owned company. But in this context, we're looking essentially at two key players, both as lenders, as underwriters, as guarantors, and sometimes as sponsors for coal projects. The China Development Bank and the China Export-Import Bank. These are both development finance institutions, meaning that they are Chinese government-backed directly, and they often partner with provincial state-owned enterprises, sometimes private enterprises as well, engineering, procurement, and construction providers as well, which is covered in a paper cited at the bottom here. And just to give you a flavor of the potential mismatch between rhetoric and reality here, this is some obviously translated, but quotes from the 2022 guidelines from the Ministry of Ecology and Environment of China, requiring all overseas development finance to fit the paradigm of the sustainable development of foreign investment, the construction of a green belt and road, and the construction of a new ecological development pattern. There are obviously nuances and meanings that are lost in translation here, but you get the general idea. But Chinese entities, mostly CDB and Exim, have provided financing largely in the last 10 years, although not exclusively, for almost 40 gigawatts of operating capacity. And this is as of 2 weeks ago or so, with the update to the China Global Power Database that BU manages, with another 14 gigawatts still under construction and 4.5 gigawatts still in the planning stages. That's across about 110 units. 70 of those we know feature CDB or Exim as lenders. It could be much higher, but there are quite a few data gaps, which happens all the time when you're doing China research. But I think we're confident enough to say that both of these institutions are extremely important. How are these distributed? Mostly in terms of capacity in Southeast Asia and South Asia. 4 countries in particular stand out: Indonesia, Vietnam, South Africa, and Pakistan. Obviously, South Africa is in South Africa. In previous versions of this data, which I was using up until not too long ago, India was also on this on the sort of top 5 list. And that's been removed, not because it's not important, but because in most cases, it's not direct lending that's going on. It's more engineering contracts. So there is exposure and relationships going on there, just not necessarily debt or equity ownership. And I mean, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Australia, Bangladesh, and a few others that are in there as well. But really, we're just looking at a few countries here. And the average age of plants in BRI coal plants in all of those countries, except Brazil, Singapore, and Australia, and there's about 20 odd countries, are less than 10 years old, meaning they have 20 years to run, meaning that they will have to be retired early to an extent if we're going to meet this 2040 no unabated coal target. So yeah, this just kind of gives you, the color's got a bit strange, but you can see in Pakistan, the years since commissioning, which essentially means turning on the plant, more or less, is only 4 years. So they're some of the youngest. In Indonesia, it's 7 years. In Vietnam, it's 8 years. And in the data set that these numbers are pulled from, the annual emissions of that fleet, just of China financed plants, is about 200 million tons a year of CO2, meaning a total committed emissions based on the expected lifetime of each plant in that data set of just under 5 gigatons or billion tons of CO2. And so if you retired each plant in that set 5 years early, which is not particularly extreme or not, certainly imaginable, that would directly avoid a gigaton of CO2 based on their estimates. So what did we do? Something quite simple, really. We built a financial model using discounted cash flows with scenario analysis, using essentially hypothetical values for coal plants. And the reason for that is essentially that although you can identify these plants, it's very, very difficult to get hold of the contracts underpinning them, or even some defensible estimates of the exact cost for each individual plant. So we decided to model something based on defensible values. And the reason for this is essentially that the numbers that we come up with are really a guide. They're not intended to be point estimates used directly in decision making. But we model a refinancing year in which a subsidy or a carbon financing commitment is started, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute, and a retirement year in which the plant stops operating. And whenever I'm talking about net present values, so discounted future cash flows, I'm talking about them at the point of refinancing, not from the point of view of today. So a plant could be refinanced in year 5, year 7, year 9, and so on. So there are two categories, one of which is concessional finance, one of which is concessional carbon finance. Concessional finance has two flavors in our model. One is just a buyout, meaning that whichever entity comes in to refinance the plant will buy out all the debt and equity net present value. So that's all the future cash flows that would accrue to the debt provider and to the equity provider, and they would retire the plant immediately. In the concessional finance model, you actually have a subsidy that's paid to the debt and equity holders that allows the refinancing entity to achieve its originally expected return, but the plant is still retired early. Now, the reason you might be interested in the second option versus the first is when you have capital constraints where it's just not possible because of the way the contract has been set up for you to necessarily back out of something. We'll get to the specific context in more detail later. Just a little bit of math, so to reassure you that I'm not just making this up. So what we do to calculate the subsidy that would need to be paid to retire a plant early, you can either do this by paying a flat subsidy in terms of the monetary amount upfront, based on lost cash flows, so cash flows that would not materialize if the plant was retired early. And you can actually calculate the implied interest rate using an iterative approach based on this formula. Just can't be calculated algebraically, but you can back out the implied interest rate on that and thereby calculate the interest rate subsidy that you're effectively providing, which in the modeling we've done cannot be higher than the original interest rate or the rate of return if you're talking about equity. For modeling purposes, although equity cash flows do vary over time, whereas debt cash flows typically are set as annuities, so it's the same every year, we take these uneven cash flows and we just convert them into an equivalent annuity for the purposes of the analysis. So it's an approximation, but it's a relatively good approximation. So the present cost of the subsidy at the point of refinancing needed to ensure that the refinancing entity can still achieve its financial goals. And there's obviously a whole debate over whether this should be the case, but we're just assuming that it is for now, is given as follows. I'm just giving this for information. I can come back to it later. I'm not sure anyone's particularly interested in going through the detail of this, but it's essentially based on compensating for cash flows that are no longer happening because the plant retires early. So the carbon finance versions of this slightly different. So in a carbon buyout, we calculate a future price on avoided carbon, which is only generated after the plant retires to avoid risk of moral hazard and so on, to buy out the remaining debt and equity NPV at the point of refinancing. So that's essentially the carbon price that the plant owner would need to be assured of to justify retiring the plant immediately on a purely financial basis. And it's sort of a parallel to what has been called debt for nature swaps. This is essentially a debt for carbon swap. And the reason I'm saying that is because the future price on avoided carbon may not be an actual price. It may just be what a government is willing to pay based on the social cost of carbon to achieve the closure of this plant early. And we're sort of agnostic as to that. Of course, if you can achieve this price through a carbon market, although that's unlikely without some sort of state-backed guarantee, because you're looking out 20 years or 15 years or whatever it happens to be, we're sort of staying away from that debate. The concessional carbon finance flavor is also an avoided carbon price that we calculate, but it's essentially what is the avoided carbon price that you would need in order to fund the subsidy estimates that we calculated earlier to 100% level. You could also say, what carbon price would you need to fund half of the subsidy and so on. On calculating emissions, this is all fairly straightforward, but the emissions associated with a plant operating with a capacity factor and an emissions factor are given as follows. And avoided emissions are annual emissions that would not be emitted in a given retirement scenario, but would have been emitted under a sort of business as usual scenario, given a lifetime L. So yeah, this is all just algebra saying what I've just described, and we can come back to it in questions. Now, this is something that we had a bit of, well, I wouldn't say trouble with, but we thought about it in some detail, is how do you allocate avoided emissions among debt and equity holders? And what we decided to do was to allocate avoided debt emissions according to the debt ratio at the time the avoided emissions are materialized. So this effectively means that as the debt is paid down over time, the share of avoided emissions that debt holders are able to monetize also falls over time. Now this is something that we could probably do in 2 or 3 different ways, but just for the purposes of this exercise, this is how we did it. And then again, this is just bringing together what I've said. Carbon revenue is generated by putting a price on avoided emissions. It's monetized only after the plant retires. It's valued on a net present basis at the refinancing provider's discount rate. That's quite a lot to hold in your head. But essentially, what we realized as we went through the process of modeling this is you've got at least 3 discount rates or costs of capital. Number 1 is the original debt provider. Number 2 is the refinancing provider, which could still be the same rate, but typically if you're refinancing, you would lower the cost of capital. And then because a third entity is actually paying for the subsidy, the cost of the subsidy to that entity would need to be discounted on the basis of that entity's discount rate, which could be a government, but not necessarily. So we had to make sure that we were treating all these discount rates correctly. So just final stuff on technical notes before I get to results. For a carbon buyout, where you're using the carbon price to buy out all the future cash flows, the price must be such that the net present value of remaining cash flows equals the net present value of carbon revenues. And this, interestingly, again, we realized as we built out the model, this actually yields different prices for debt and equity, which you might expect. And if you want to find the carbon price that exactly pays off both debt and equity providers by overcompensating one and using the overcompensation to meet the shortfall for the other, this is how you would do it. For concessional carbon finance, it's essentially the same thing. We're just using CCP for the concessional carbon price to denote the same thing, but it needs to be calculated such that it covers the cost of the concessional finance subsidy that we've arrived at in previous stages, scaled by the avoided emissions that subsidy is supposed to be paying for. And equally, to find the carbon price that exactly pays the subsidy for debt and equity, you would do a similar averaging process as we've got here. I'll skip over the key inputs, but we can come back to them, particularly if you've got criticisms over the numbers that we've used. This is still somewhat a work in progress, so we're still undergoing sensitivity analysis to see what effect that has on the results. I've already talked about tariff structure, so I won't go through it again. So let's get to some results. So what we've got here is a combination of things. So the bars are representing the cost of a buyout, retiring the plant a given number of years early. So this is a 30-year plant. So this would be essentially this year here, 24 years retired early, would refer to closing the plant 5 years into its operating life, or rather the start of year 6. And then the lines are the cost of the subsidy that would be required to achieve the same result. And the reason that we've got different lines is year 5, 10, and 15 up there, that's referring to the year in which the plant is refinanced. So for example, let's say if you refinance in year 5 and the subsidy provider pays enough of the interest on the loan to ensure the plant can be retired at the end of year 10, so 19 years early, this could be achieved at a cost to the subsidy provider of about $150 million in this case, which is about $30 million less than a full buyout in the same year if you're paying off both debt and equity. And most of this over time, as you can see, the blue bars are debt and the orange ones are equity. When the end of the loan term comes around, 18 years from the expected end of the plant's lifetime, then all of those payments just go straight to equity holders based on their future cash flows. Now, if we look at interest rate subsidies and how these work, if the post-retirement cash flows are foregone, the subsidies paid each year that would be required to replace those cash flows can be expressed either as a direct subsidy or as a subsidy to the interest rate on, or the rate of return in the case of equity that's paid on those cash flows. So the implied percentage point interest rate subsidy is given in the dotted lines, and the right-hand axis represents the share of total interest that's paid for by the subsidy. So it's essentially the same thing. We're just reframing it as an interest rate subsidy, because it can be quite it can be helpful for getting one's head around and distinguishing it from a full buyout. So if we switch now to the results for the carbon buyout, as you'd expect, the price that you would need to buy out debt is significantly higher than equity. And this is because the emissions to be monetized fall as you delay retirement of the plant, and the outstanding debt also falls. So you'll see the price that would be required to justify retiring the plant from a debt perspective rises very sharply as the term on that loan comes to its conclusion. The equity price is much, much lower. And this is because the share of emissions that are attributed to equity rises over time, but the emissions to be monetized falls over time, and the value to be compensated based on future equity cash flows also falls over time. This is quite a lot to get your head around, and we spend a lot of time trying to understand why we were getting these results, but we can return to them. Just in the interest of time, I'll keep going. If you calculate a single price on future avoided emissions across debt and equity that you would need, this is higher the sooner the plant retires, and it declines with later retirement years as the principal on the debt falls. And that kink you can see at year 17 is the point at which the debt is paid off. So the rate of decline in that price falls. But perhaps more interesting than the exact shape of the curves is that the carbon price you need is actually not very high at all on future avoided emissions. And this is even more remarkable because those emissions, or the money associated with those avoided emissions, is only being realized quite far into the future. So it's quite heavily discounted, with the exception of the debt here. If you have a single carbon price that would pay off debt and equity, it starts as about $22 per ton of CO2, and it falls to less than 5. So if you've got even a moderate social cost of carbon estimate, you should be able to justify something like this. Now, on that title's got cut off slightly, but if we're looking at concessional carbon finance, we're looking for a price on carbon revenue that equals the subsidy amount that's been provided. This falls over time again as the subsidy rate declines. It rebounds slightly once the debt is paid off, and then it keeps declining, but more slowly. And importantly, it doesn't depend on the year in which you refinance, because the avoided emissions are realized at the same point in time. So these different colors are the year in which you commit to monetizing the subsidy, but it doesn't really matter when you do that. So that provides a little bit more flexibility than in the others. So those are results, but I just want to reiterate that we shouldn't really be paying too much attention to the numbers, other than by comparing the costs of different options and just getting more or less a feel for how expensive this might be, just as an order of magnitude. Of course, it's really an intellectual exercise or a modeling exercise, and it's really not intended to be, empirically accurate. So the results will be used as a useful guide to costs, but they really need to be situated in context. So that's what I'll do in the closing part of this talk. So just going through the 4 countries of interest in turn. India, as you might know, is already experiencing a high growth rate in electricity demand. It's expected to rise another 35% from high baseline by the mid-2030s. Coal makes up 60% of this generation. Coal demand is expected to rise by more than 50% by the end of the decade. Coal imports are rising as well, which is not necessarily good economic news for India, partly because domestic coal is relatively low quality. But on the other hand, India has been very successful in deploying solar at a very large scale, about 50% ahead of the targets it set in 2014 when Modi became president. Now, interestingly, on coal, the proposed new capacity has declined 3/4 just in the last 7 years, and that's a lot. So we're talking 300 gigawatts, bearing in mind that the total BRI coal fleet is 10% of that. 300 gigawatts cancelled, 250 delayed. There's still 30 under construction. But the load factors on coal have also been declining, which has an effect on the economics of coal plant operations. And although the conversation on coal retirement in India is not nearly as advanced as it is in some other jurisdictions, the very prestigious government think tank Niti Aayog has proposed a retirement of 50 gigawatts of older subcritical capacity. And the country's also upgraded its target for renewables to 500 gigawatts by 2030. This graphic simply just shows how capacity factors for the existing coal fleet have declined over time. And we'll see this again in the other countries of interest. But this is a signal that the economics of operating coal are not looking very good. And of course, there's this rebound effect going on from 2020 to 2022, partly due to the recovery from COVID. But some of the other interesting features include a marked difference between the use of coal plants that are owned by central state-owned enterprises versus private enterprises versus state-level state-owned enterprises, which, you know, unless the economics are fundamentally different, which is unlikely, implies that centrally owned companies are getting potentially a greater share of electricity demand to supply. The important political economy factors in India, besides the understanding the reasons why the country has promoted solar, there's quite a lot of interesting literature on this, but they suggest that it's a mixture of the need to attract new investment into the energy sector, particularly from abroad, a narrative on energy independence, domestic politics meaning that the commitment to solar was quite instrumental, according to this analysis, in propelling Modi to the presidency. And although India has a very favorable renewable policy environment, this is nevertheless still hampered by severe political and structural constraints. So these are, of course, entrenched political actors, but also a need for wider market reform in how electricity is marketed and how coal is purchased, and in particular, the cross-subsidization of other industries from coal revenues. So, for example, India's railways depend very heavily on revenue from the coal industry. You start taking that out, and then suddenly your railways don't have a functional business model. Turning to Indonesia, Indonesia makes up almost half of energy use across the ASEAN nations. It has a state-owned utility with a monopoly over distribution as well as generation and transmission, and it's the sole off-taker for independent power producers, which include American companies in the country. There's many thousand islands, but 8 of them make up almost all demand, and most of the remote areas outside the big metropolitan areas or the larger islands depend on imported diesel. Now, demand was expected in 2014 to triple by 2030. That's unlikely to happen now, and actually in a talk last week, we were treated to a kind of insider's perspective on this, and the prevailing view seems to be essentially that the government overestimated economic growth and ended up, in the short term at least, overbuilding, particularly on coal. So ironically, there's an excess supply of electricity at points in the Indonesian system, and the same applies to Pakistan. I'll get to that in a second. But renewable investment is still woefully low, although that number seems big, 1.5 billion. It's only a fifth of the requirement just to meet the existing targets to 2025, which, as I mentioned, were 23%. Just like India, domestic coal is about 60%. Well, coal is 60% of generation. In Indonesia, it's almost all domestic because of the vast resources, and also Indonesia's largest export, including to China. This essentially just kind of tracks how coal has grown over time, and you can see this is the black bar. From 1990, it's become a very significant part of the energy supply. Key political economy factors. Well, Indonesia has an abundant resource of domestic coal, which essentially has led to a political endorsement of expansionist coal power policies. And why is this? Essentially because in almost all cases, those resources are either owned by government or they're owned by private interests in the form of oligarchs who have, if you look through the literature, which I'm not going to quote in a lot of detail here, back the finding that energy policy is still contingent on the backing of economic elites. Now, China's role has expanded very rapidly during the 2010s, both in terms of debt and equity and construction contracts for new coal. And coal royalties are a growing component of national and local budgets, including for education, health, and so on, which are creating these self-reinforcing interests in retaining the status quo. And now, in Indonesia's case, this is where the JETP mechanism is not necessarily going to solve all its problems. Most of the coal fleet is constrained by investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms, which essentially protect private companies from changes in energy policy that might threaten their assets. This covers 90% of Indonesia's foreign-owned plants. And on top of that, the ASEAN-China Treaty protects specifically 12 China-backed units, most of which are subcritical, meaning less efficient. Turning quickly to Pakistan, Pakistan's been experiencing regular energy supply crises for a number of years, but demand is still rising. And although historically marginal or incremental demand has been met with a combination of hydro, gas, and oil, it's only very recently that we've seen a very rapid shift towards meeting marginal demand of coal. And there are a number of factors behind that, which I won't go into detail in, other than to say that it got to the point where expanding the electricity system depended on investment that was increasingly hard to attract. And China was essentially the only lender willing to engage after Korea and Japan dropped out of consideration. So solar and wind is around in Pakistan, but it's not contributing a large share of supply. And the new fleet of coal plants, bearing in mind the average age of about 4 years, financed through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, have been financed in exchange for very high equity returns. It's not completely clear what these are, but they're in the range of 27 to 35% annually, which is astonishingly high. These are essentially guaranteed equity returns for 20, 25 years. The reimbursement of insurance fees from Sinosure, the state-backed Chinese insurer, shortening loan terms and providing government guarantees on revenues. And this has led directly to very rapidly rising debt liabilities towards Chinese counterparties and rising coal import costs, since Pakistan, although it's discovered fairly recently some domestic coal, there's really the lack of significant infrastructure and investment required to avoid import dependency. And this has understandably led to changes in intended policy, but in reality, Pakistan finds itself in an exceptionally difficult position. So a very young coal fleet, high asset stranding costs, very unfavorable contracts, particularly with Chinese counterparts, and a high degree of difficulty in attracting new investment, given the unstable outlook. I know I'm running out of time, I think, so I'll quickly go over Vietnam. Again, demand is growing about 10% a year. Historically, this has been hydropower based, but now it's 60% from fossil fuels, of which coal is a relatively large part. Been successful in developing solar capacity, and the power development plan, which runs on essentially a 10-year increments and is fairly analogous to the 5-year plans in China, given Vietnam's communist government, has been redrafted several times in the last few months and is now looking much more favorable for rapid wind expansion and a slowing in coal capacity growth. But coal is now reaching half a generation, and Vietnam finds itself with a not dissimilar problem to some of its peers. I won't go over political economy factors because they're broadly similar. So what do we find when we're comparing these 4 important countries? Well, double-digit demand growth in the medium term per year, which means you'll need additional grid generation capacity, whatever happens. So if you're retiring coal, you've not only got to replace it with renewables, you've got to build something more on top of that. A prominent role for coal in the electricity mix, a very weak financial outlook for coal, at least at the aggregate level, due to competition from renewables, high fuel costs, and low load factors, and long-term decarbonization goals that really imply an end for coal and a need to attract very significant new private investment in most cases to replace coal and find ways of retiring it early. Some of the key differences is that India and Vietnam were quite successful in investing in solar expansion. Indonesia and Pakistan have failed to, which is due to a number of factors, but partly at least due to a lack of policy supports and short-term oversupply that is sending all the wrong signals into the market. And India and Vietnam, I think it's fair to say, also have more advanced discussion and discourse around the early retirement of coal. Pakistan and Indonesia have fewer alternatives and much heavier financial burdens. So applying the actor objective context framework that was partly developed and has been applied to coal phase out by my colleague Ryan Rafferty, essentially is a fairly parsimonious way of drawing conclusions from political economy analysis based on the relationships between actors and what the extent of power that they can wield and the context in which they're operating. So briefly, in the 4 countries we're looking at, these are the head of state, the ruling party, the regulators, the electricity ministry, and the cabinet ministries with energy portfolios. And I've put civil society organizations with a cross out here because when it comes to energy policy formation, there are some exceptions to this, but broadly speaking, there's really not that much of a role at the moment, just looking at it dispassionately. And then on the economic side, we're looking mainly at electric utilities, coal mining companies and their brokers as political patrons that really need to be on board with any major change in energy policy direction for it to have a chance of lasting success. Interestingly, looking at coal policy as it's articulated by all of these actors across the 4 countries, 3 things come up again and again and again: economic growth, security of energy supply, and affordable energy supplies. So anything that doesndoesn't really meet those 3 criteria is going to find itself, is going to be very challenging to get through. And among sort of non-marginal actors, there's relatively little mention of policies for early coal retirement in all of these countries, although it's a little further ahead in India and Vietnam. The historical institutional factors point to power market design as a binding constraint, and that it's a very difficult thing to actually undertake over a short period of time. China is a shining example of this, where power market reform has been on the agenda for well over 10 years now. Other key historical factors include the ownership of power assets, the distribution network, and so on. And the last point I'll draw your attention to, modalities for infrastructure financing, because this is most likely to be the way in to get early retirement of coal plant instruments off the ground. So when we're linking all these things together, we can conclude that political actors constrained by economic actors and market structure might see infrastructure finance, most likely from external sources, as the only legitimate and politically secure way of growing the energy system while phasing out coal. So the conclusion is actually that foreign capital will most likely pay for coal phase out. Now, since we're looking at BRI coal, the conclusion really is that Chinese lenders' engagement is probably necessary for anything to get off the ground when it comes to retiring these plants early. Now, this could take the form of transferring the assets to other Chinese entities. It could mean a public subsidy that's able to facilitate the early retirement of these assets, or it could mean the transfer of BRI-funded coal plants to international blended funds, such as the Energy Transition Mechanism or the Just Energy Transition Partnership. But this may be more difficult to achieve, given that in many cases, these investments are fairly strategic and part of a larger partnership with the host country on the side of China. So there are various models that might actually work, but our key conclusion really is that this can be done, and it can be done at reasonable costs, both in terms of subsidies and debt for carbon swaps, or however you might want to term them. But that the solutions to actually funding these possible options are unlikely to arise domestically, given very limited fiscal space, all sorts of political constraints, and that the early retirement of these plants will most likely require the engagement of Chinese lenders in refinancing, subsidizing, swapping, or transferring debt and equity cash flows. And there are a range of ways you can do this. So thanks for listening. I know I went on for a little bit, but look forward to your questions, and thanks for being here.
Thank you, Alex. We have time for some questions. I'm going to ask the first question, and then we'll pass around the mic. So you have this, what you described as a hypothetical analysis. Maybe we describe it as sort of a representative analysis of a coal-fired power plant. Wondering if you've done some sensitivity analysis on expected lifetime of a plant. So I think you were assuming 30 years. And at least I know from the US experience, we have a lot of coal-fired power plants that went much longer than their originally planned lifetimes. Yeah. You're also using a certain discount rate on sort of the interest rate on debt. And when we think about differences in lifetimes and differences in the tenor of debt and the rates used can have some significant implications. I'm wondering if you've looked at any of those to get a sense of like which assumptions are the sort of bottom lines, whether it's the sort of the carbon price or the concessional carbon price, et cetera. Which ones, which parameters appear to be sort of, those bottom line results are most sensitive to in this analysis?
Thank you for the question. So we're still in the process of undertaking the sensitivity analyses, so I won't give you numbers or anything. But whenever you're doing a financial discount analysis, it's always the discount rate and the value of cash flows over time that affects things. So if you mess around with the delta between the original cost of debt and the refinance cost of net, and then you add a subsidy on top of that, there is some really interesting dynamics. Um, when it comes to the structure of the tariff, that's also very important. And addressing your first question about plant lifetime, we decided not to extend it to 40, 50 years, even though under a business as usual scenario with no climate constraints and so on, as you say, it's most likely those plants would operate for 50 years. Um, Partly because we think, extending a lifetime of a plant past 30 years at this point is extremely unlikely for many reasons, not just climate related, but also to do with competition and so on. So we thought it was an unlikely enough scenario that we could just discount it. That's obviously debatable. Yeah, I think that probably answers it.
Thank you so much, Alex, for your presentation. I am Betsy Figueroa, I'm a career MPA student. I wanted to ask you about this decision of China of stop funding coal projects in around the Belt and Road initiative countries. How this affect your conclusions? And do you think those countries are going to migrate to other kind of fundings internationally, or they are going to migrate to green funding?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for raising that because I did not mention it. For those of you who weren't aware, last year, President Xi Jinping of China committed to not financing any new coal through the BRI outside China. And what that means in practice is a little bit of interpretation game as to whether it means that stuff that's already been committed to is still going to be built. But it's probably fair to say that now that China is pulling out of the market as a provider of financing, it's much harder for countries that want to build more coal plants to do so. So it's not to say that the coal fleet outside China will not keep growing. It probably will slightly in the short term, particularly for these plants that are already in process. But it's unlikely to rise significantly, and we'll probably see a peaking of capacity, as we've already seen a peaking, according to some analysts anyway, of coal consumption, so that the average utilization rate of the existing fleet is going to be slowly declining, potentially rapidly declining, depending on how quickly you can build out wind and solar. But if you look at the policy documents, at least, not only has China's government committed to not financing new coal, it's also trying to mainstream solar and wind, and et cetera, through the BRI as well. There are all sorts of unanswered questions over carbon capture and storage and other forms of energy that are not wind and solar and the more familiar renewables. But it's pretty unlikely you'll see a massive growth in new coal, even from non-Chinese sources, I think. Is there a question over here?
Hello, Alexander from Master in Public Policy, MPP here, first year. Question goes to the unabated coal plants versus the coal plants that have carbon capture technologies. What is the environmental difference in our environmental impact? And is the upgrading existing coal plants part of the transitory solution towards reducing the emissions, but still guaranteeing the economic growth that developing countries are heavily relying on coal? Thank you.
Thank you. So one of my co-authors, Girish Ramali, and Abhinav Jindal as well, are really the experts on this subject, and they've written a separate paper published recently looking at the feasibility of repurposing coal assets. There are a bunch of different ways you can do this, including fuel switching. In Vietnam, this is actually being proposed, fuel switching to green ammonia. Whether you think that's a good idea or not is a whole different question. The use of flywheels in coal plants as energy storage. There are all sorts. There's a long list of things you can do. When it comes to carbon capture, now this captures the carbon and sequesters it or does something else with it when it comes to operating the coal plant, but it doesn't mean that a lot of the local environmental impacts are still not going to happen. And that's not just airborne toxins. It's also building on indigenous land, which is a big issue in Vietnam at the moment, and is actually, bearing in mind it's a single party state, there's sufficient local political opposition to expanding coal that it's actually becoming a bit of a consideration in the the policy formation process. So all of the other negative externalities on the local level associated with coal don't necessarily disappear, and they're all very significant. And then, of course, there's coal mining and so on. Am I waiting for my microphone?
Yeah.
Sorry, yes.
Hi, Alex. Carissa, BP1. So I do want to ask you on Indonesia, since it's the hot topic right now, especially on the JETP grants, a combination of, I think, grants and bonds, right? You mentioned about the ISDS protection and how that may have prevented the JETP program to kind of advance. Do you think then a part of the funding should go into looking at how we can, go around the ISDS protection, or what would you recommend Indonesia can do to make renewable energy happen, given that we already have oversupply in Java and Bali, and that we're building a new capital? Yeah, thanks.
So the ISDS, the Investor State Dispute Settlement Mechanism, is essentially an arbitration proceeding, as far as I understand, and I'm really not familiar with the details. But in looking up all of the reporting on JETP and some of the press releases and so on, I couldn't see anything referring to this. And it may be the case that some of the private lenders that they've got on board with this initiative are in a position to voluntarily waive their rights under ISDS. But the fact that it's not mentioned, I don't know, I'm a little skeptical that this 5 gigawatts of coal that they mentioned specifically might just be exempted from it, or it's just easy cases. But fundamentally, if you're going to retire the entire fleet, particularly those financed by China and protected by the China-ASEAN Treaty, which is on top of ISDS, it's not going to be easy. And will require something much more significant in terms of international governance and law. Who has the microphone? Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm Benny Subianto from Indonesia. I just want to continue my compatriot questions. If I understand correctly, you were a bit skeptical about JETP in Indonesia. I do share your concern. My question is, why suddenly it was out of the blue last week during the G20 summit, the US announced about the JETP, $20 billion JETP program for Indonesia. What is the reason for that? Because if you look what happened in Indonesia, Indonesia has no commitment to transition to renewable energy. A few months ago, a colleague of mine, a Japanese colleague of mine, told me that the Japanese government already concerned about what's Indonesia going to do with the JETP program. Because as far as I understand, they just want to privatize the state-owned IPPs and then taken over by the OIGA. And Indonesia have abundance of renewable energy, and the government has no commitment to develop the renewable energy. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, and no doubt you know far more than I do about this particular situation, given your presentation last week. But I mean, my default position on any of these big announcements is to be skeptical. And if you try and look through the announcements to try and figure out exactly what's going on, there's a nice $20 billion figure put up there, but according to what we can figure out from what's been published, only about 4% of that is going to be in the form of grants. The rest will be a mixture of concessional and private finance. And underlying it is still essentially the same Washington consensus model of the best thing to do is just privatize this stuff. And that will get you some way, perhaps with discrete plants or discrete projects. But fundamentally, I'm not sure if you agree with me or not. Privatizing PLN and the whole apparatus of the Indonesian energy sector is an extremely unlikely thing to happen, certainly not in time for net zero. So, I just hope that they have a plan for dealing with the bigger picture as well. But yes, I would also be skeptical. It is so perhaps unfair to say that it's just come out the woodwork. I mean, I know that this has been under discussion for a year or so, and it's building partly on the South African model as well. So we might see additional JETP partnerships emerging with other countries too. But as you know, there's always an element of political horse trading in the background and geopolitics and so on and so forth. Definitely not qualified to comment on that, but I'd be very surprised if there's not some other quid pro quo going on in the background. Thank you for the question.
Hi, Alex. Kevin Lee from MPP1 from China. You've identified sort of the possible political or economic incentives for the BRI recipient countries to undertake some sort of transition to beyond coal. But when looking at that lack of transparent relationship with China, have you looked into identifying what possible sets of motivations or drivers are needed, whether strategically or whether kind of tactically in terms of international negotiation, in order to, allow these Chinese state-owned enterprise players or the central government to say, okay, let's take a look at transitioning from coal?
Mm-hmm. Excellent question. I mean, part of what we were trying to do with this paper was just to sort of put some numbers on the problem, partly to be able to articulate to Chinese policymakers and stakeholders within China that this is a potential option. And I'm sure that that's already been considered in detail, but it's very hard to know what's really going on, particularly over the last 2-3 years within the Chinese state. But we haven't addressed this in this paper in detail. I think it'd be a really interesting project for future work building on it, to really look into what sort of configuration might motivate a central Chinese SOE, a provincial Chinese SOE, which is often a very different story, with a greater need to offset liabilities associated with the real estate sector, for example, and really varies by province. When would it make sense to do this? Well, it might be the case that by allowing a coal plant to retire 10 years early, by subsidizing it or moving it to a bad asset bank, which China has done before to deal with overcapacity in the steel sector, albeit domestically, you could free up space for new investment in the energy sector in that host country. Guess who's going to provide the equipment and probably the financing? Yeah, it's China. So it's potentially a market expanding opportunity for Chinese exporters, both those backed by a state interest and by a private or pseudo-private interest, simply because a lot of these countries are now in a position where coal is such a serious liability and generating such high opportunity costs that it's almost restricting the set of production possibilities that would otherwise be the case. So, luckily, all of the indicators are heading in a direction that makes that argument easier and easier to make over time. So yeah, you have to look at it in detail, but I think there are ways in which this could be articulated as a win-win.
Thank you very much. I'm Zina Agger. I'm a fellow at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. I'm not an expert in a lot of what you've talked about today, but something that occurred to me a few times as you were talking is, what is the public perception within these host countries of both coal and coal phase out? Obviously, there's a fear, or I suspect a fear, of losing jobs and what that might do to the local economy, but also just in terms of the discourse within these states, one party or not, how are people on the ground experiencing this or approaching coal phase out?
Mm-hmm. That's a very complicated question with different answers in each country, but there's certainly a degree of identification of coal with some form of national development narrative or rhetoric, and it can also vary within countries. So for example, in India, some states are much more involved in coal production than others. And in some cases, the entire economy, both in terms of jobs and GDP growth and so on, would depend almost entirely on coal, and you've got a real challenge on your hands there. You see the same thing mirrored within China. I'm really not familiar with enough with the details of the politics of coal in each of these countries to comment, with confidence. But there's almost certainly a hurdle to be overcome in narrative and discourse, in addition to the economics, both at the sort of the level of realpolitik and state-owned companies and political patronage and so on, but also potentially at the sort of more national and local level, particularly where coal is funding most of the social programs or social security funds and so on, as is the case in China, but potentially also in some of the host countries for BRI coal.
So before we wrap up, a reminder, we'll meet again at noon next week on Monday, the 28th. We'll be hosting Rich Glick, who's the chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Chairman Glick will be speaking on how climate change awakened a sleepy little agency. And finally, please join me in thanking Alex Clark for his presentation today. Thank you, Alex.